The war had dragged on for years, some said decades, though official records blurred over the true length. For the countless civilizations of the intergalactic coalition, it had become more than just a struggle for territory or ideology. It was survival. The Qadari were unlike any enemy the coalition had ever faced. Ruthless, efficient, and relentless, they didn't negotiate, they didn't stall. They advanced always. What began as a border skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale conflict spanning star systems. One by one, major coalition strongholds fell. The Zin Consortium lost its twin outposts in the Delvar sector in a single week. The Velnari Republic's elite fleet was torn apart in a battle that lasted mere hours. The Urkson Dominion, once boasting the galaxy's second-largest navy, had been reduced to scattered convoys and whispered regrets. No one was spared. Every race had thrown themselves into the conflict with everything they had. Resources were drained. Ships were built faster than crews could be trained to fly them. Young soldiers were pulled from academies mid-training and sent into battle with only the most basic knowledge of combat. Emergency alliances were forged. Ancient rivalries were buried under the crushing weight of necessity. But it wasn't enough. Every victory was fleeting. Every push forward was met with a harder, sharper pushback. The Qadari didn't just fight, they dismantled. They studied each coalition tactic and adapted with terrifying speed. What worked one week would fail catastrophically the next. It was a war of attrition, and the Qadari were winning. In the coalition war rooms, morale fluctuated like solar winds. Commanders debated strategies that had already failed, clinging to hope like it was a lifeline. Fleet deployments became increasingly desperate, often ending in complete annihilation. Massive superweapons were launched with fanfare, only to be countered with chilling precision. The war was bleeding the galaxy dry. And through it all, humanity watched. They were members of the coalition officially, at least. The humans had signed the treaties, sent ambassadors, and showed up at the intergalactic summits. They had contributed resources, shared intelligence, and provided logistic support to exhausted allies. But when it came to battle, when it came to shedding blood, they were conspicuously absent. At first, no one questioned it. Earth was new to the galactic stage, a relatively young race compared to the ancient empires surrounding them. They called themselves a supportive force, citing their desire to avoid escalating the conflict unnecessarily. Many in the coalition accepted that excuse. Others rolled their eyes, interpreting humanity's restraint as cowardice dressed in diplomacy. After all, what could the humans possibly offer that the rest of the galaxy hadn't already tried? Whispers circulated in the back rooms of command centers. Some claimed the humans were afraid. Others accused them of hiding behind the coalition, while reaping the benefits of alliance. A few theorized that Earth simply lacked the military might to be of any real use. Their ships, while sleek and compact, lacked the overbearing weapon arrays typical of coalition warcraft. Their presence on the battlefield was minimal, if not invisible. And yet, there were always those who wondered. Rumors had floated around for years, whispers of human combat drills so advanced that their soldiers could run full-scale simulations in real time. Tales of hidden fleets tucked away in deep space hangars, constantly training, never resting. Stories of intelligence agencies monitoring battle data from afar, compiling strategies not yet seen on the battlefield. Most dismissed such rumors as death world or bravado, exaggerated tales from a race known for storytelling and dramatic flair. But still, the question lingered: why hadn't humanity fought? General Corvo of the Zin Consortium had asked himself that question many times. He had lost good men, entire crews trying to hold the Driacon corridor against the Qadari. He had watched brave species burn and noble fleets vanish. And through it all, the humans remained a step removed. Corvo had met their diplomats. Polite, measured, always calm. He had sat through briefings with their logistic coordinators, sharp-minded, efficient, but emotionally distant. They were always helpful, never panicked, but also never involved, never present on the front line. And now, as he stared at the war map, dozens of systems blinking red, strongholds overrun, supply lines severed, Corvo couldn't help but wonder, had they waited too long? Was this war even winnable anymore? In the Coalition's most secure command center, surrounded by holographic projections of fallen territories and casualty statistics that numbed the soul, Corvo and other top commanders planned yet another counteroffensive. It was a routine that had long lost its meaning. They would allocate what ships they had left, send reinforcements to already failing outposts, and hope irrationally that this time something would break the pattern. But before those orders were given, everything changed. The room fell silent as a communique came in from the Human Council of Earth. It was short, precise, effective immediately. Humanity will engage in active combat operations against the Qadari threat. No explanation, no preamble. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then came the questions. Is this real? Are they serious? Why now? Admiral Marek of the Archok Union confirmed the message, his scaled face unreadable. They've made their intentions clear. 10 minutes ago, Earth fleet assets entered the contested sector near KR. Corvo rubbed his temples, struggling to process the sudden shift. After years of silence, after all the death and loss and desperation, the humans had chosen now to act. A strange mix of emotions stirred within him. Hope, suspicion, frustration, maybe all of it. What do they think they can do with a few ships? One officer scoffed. Another added, if they'd acted sooner, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But Corvo remained silent, watching the tactical map shift. Tiny human signals, barely noticeable at first, appeared along the edge of the battlefield. Their formation was tight, deliberate. Not a single move wasted, not a single ship out of place. It wasn't a fleet, it was a scalpel. The first time in years, the war had taken a different tone. A new player had entered, not with fanfare or spectacle, but with purpose, and no one knew what would happen next. It started without warning, no formal buildup, no dramatic speeches, no pageantry. Humanity entered the war not with a bang, but with a whisper, a sudden shift in the data stream, a flicker on the sensors, a new cluster of unknown ships appearing at the edge of contested space. To most, it didn't look like much. A few vessels, clean and compact in design, nothing like the lumbering behemoths that the other races fielded. The Coalition war room, usually tense with frustration or frenzied with planning, fell completely silent. All eyes locked onto the central holographic display as the sensor feeds updated. The tags confirmed what no one believed would ever happen. Human military forces had entered the theater of war. General Corvo stared at the blue icons materializing near the Kiar sector. "Is that them?" he asked, voice low, almost disbelieving. "Yes, General," Admiral Marek replied. "That is Earth's fleet. They've begun tactical positioning." Corvo blinked hard, as if the act would somehow clarify the image or change what he was seeing. But it didn't. The ships were real, and they were moving. "They've been watching this whole time," he murmured. A murmur of disbelief spread through the room. For years, the Coalition had been locked in a war of attrition against the Qadari, year after year of grinding losses, retreat after retreat. Every race had thrown everything they had into the fire. Worlds had fallen, fleets had been shattered, and yet the humans, they had waited. They had offered medical aid, logistics, supplies, but they never fought. Now, without warning, they were here. The fleet was modest by Coalition standards. No oversized battleships, no overly armed flagships, no flashy shields or massive energy signatures. Just a lean formation of high-speed destroyers, a handful of escort frigates, and a sleek command vessel at the center. "That's it?" someone in the room muttered, unable to contain their skepticism. "Where's the rest of it?" No one had an answer. Corvo leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as he watched the human formation drift into position with unnerving precision. Unlike most coalition fleets, whose deployments were often chaotic or brute force in nature, these ships moved like fingers of the same hand. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The Qadari noticed too. Within minutes of the human fleet's arrival, the enemy began to reposition. Their command protocols lit up with activity as they shifted their defensive lines and funneled reinforcements toward the new threat. It was almost insulting, like the Qadari didn't even see the humans as a serious opponent, just another species to bulldoze. Then everything changed. It began with static. Then came blackouts. Sensor feeds from the front lines started to fail. Communication between coalition outposts fractured. Entire swaths of data went dark. "What's going on?" Corvo demanded. Admiral Marek looked up from his display. "Electromagnetic interference. But more than that, they're jamming everything." "Who?" "The humans." The room fell into stunned silence. Within minutes, the Qadari fleet's formations began to unravel. Their long-range weapons went blind. Targeting systems failed to lock. Radar and sensor sweeps came back blank or scrambled. It was as if the entire Qadari armada had been struck blind in the middle of a gunfight. "What the hell are they doing?" Marek asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Electronic warfare," Corvo replied slowly. "But not like anything we've seen." Across the battlefield, human ships danced through space with eerie elegance. Their movements were fluid, almost casual, yet every maneuver was calculated. They accelerated toward weak points in the Qadari lines, slipped past defensive grids with impossible timing, and launched precise high-velocity projectiles that punched through enemy hulls like paper. There were no massive explosions, no dramatic firestorms, just clean, surgical strikes. Power nodes disabled, engines shattered, weapons systems silenced. "This isn't warfare," one of the tactical officers whispered. It's a performance." And he wasn't wrong. The human fleet moved with such coordination that it felt choreographed, like they weren't reacting to the enemy's moves, but predicting them. The Qadari had spent years adapting to every coalition tactic, but now they were scrambling slow, confused, outmaneuvered at every turn. "They're dissecting them," Corvo said, more to himself than anyone else. Reports flooded in. One Qadari stronghold after another was going dark. Strategic points that had held out for months collapsed in minutes. Not because the humans overwhelmed them with force, but because they cut out the parts that made resistance possible. "What kind of weapons are those?" a coalition officer asked aloud. "They're standard," a tactical analyst replied. "In theory, kinetic, plasma-based, nothing revolutionary. The way they're being used." He shook his head. "They're rewriting the rulebook." An hour passed. By then, the Qadari fleet was in full retreat. Entire sectors fell as human vessels exploited chaos with terrifying clarity. Still, not a single human ship had been destroyed. "How is that possible?" Admiral Marek asked, almost angry now. "Zero casualties against them?" Corvo had no answer. His eyes were fixed on the battlefield display. The map was lit with red zones turning blue at a speed that defied logic. At the back of the room, the doors opened. A figure stepped in, tall, calm, wearing a crisp, unadorned human uniform. No medals, no ranks on display, just an expression that was cool, collected, and utterly unreadable. The room fell quiet. "You call this a war?" the human officer said, his voice clear and level. "To us, this is a test, an exercise in tactical adaptability." No one spoke. Corvo turned slowly to face the officer. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did you wait until today?" The human studied him for a moment. "We waited until you were ready to understand our methods," he said plainly. "Ready?" Marek scoffed. "You think this is readiness?" "If you weren't," the officer said without hesitation, "the war would have ended much sooner." There was no pride in his tone, no arrogance, just truth delivered cold and blunt. The officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the humans fought, not just their methods, but their mindset. They weren't charging in with vengeance. They weren't seeking glory. They were methodical, controlled, calculated. It wasn't personal, it was math. And the Qadari were the wrong variable in their equation. What followed was not a battle, it was a masterclass in warfare. The moment the first Qadari formation collapsed under human assault, it became clear that the war had shifted into something else. Something colder, smarter, scarier. The Qadari weren't used to being on the back foot. For years, they had dictated the terms of conflict, pushing deep into coalition territory with confidence, even arrogance. Every defense, no matter how well planned or well manned, had eventually crumbled under their relentless pressure. But now they were scrambling. The human fleet hadn't even committed its full force. A fraction of their numbers had entered the field, a dozen ships at most, and yet they moved like a singular organism. Every vessel knew its role. Every maneuver anticipated the enemy's response. They weren't reacting to the Qadari, they were predicting them. Like they'd run this simulation 1,000 times before. And maybe they had. Inside the coalition war room, the disbelief had long since faded into stunned silence. Officers who had spent their careers studying enemy tactics could do nothing but watch, jaws clenched, as the Qadari's battle doctrine unraveled in real time. Entire sections of the front collapsed without a single coalition ship firing a shot. The humans were doing all the work, and they were doing it with surgical precision. "They're not just attacking positions," one analyst whispered, eyes wide as fresh data flowed across the console. "They're dismantling systems, striking at control nodes, power arrays, signal relays, everything that holds the Qadari fleet together." Corvo leaned closer to the display. It was almost hypnotic, the way human forces slipped through gaps that didn't even appear on their own tactical overlays. The Qadari were still reacting like this was a traditional war, throwing more ships into the fray, trying to overwhelm with numbers and firepower. But none of it mattered. The human ships didn't fight like anyone else. They didn't rely on shields thicker than buildings or weapons larger than spaceports. Their tech wasn't flashy, and it wasn't brute strength that won them the edge, it was precision, efficiency. Everything they did was fast, calculated, and devastating. One moment, a Qadari battleship would be targeting a human destroyer. Seconds later, its power grid would go offline, its engines failing, its hull cracking from a pinpoint strike that had bypassed armor entirely. "They're exploiting gaps we didn't even know existed," Marek muttered, staring at the display like it was a dream. "How is this possible?" another commander asked, almost afraid of the answer. A human officer in the room, calm as ever, turned slightly and replied with the same neutral tone he had used from the start: training. The word hung in the air like a quiet threat. "We trained for this scenario long before the Qadari were a known threat. Space warfare, ground combat, electronic disruption. It's all part of our doctrine." Corvo frowned. "You're saying you planned for this war before it even started?" "No," the officer replied. "We didn't plan for this war. We prepared in case of it." The distinction was subtle but chilling. While the rest of the galaxy fought only when forced to, the humans had been preparing for war as an inevitability, not just with weapons, but with ideas, strategies, layered contingency plans, scenarios rehearsed to perfection. And now, that preparation was being unleashed. Qadari fleets that had resisted every coalition attack for years were falling apart in minutes. Their attempts at countermeasures were intercepted before they even launched. Their communications were jammed before orders could be delivered. Their command structure, once the backbone of their battlefield superiority, was disintegrating under the weight of a strategy they simply couldn't comprehend. "What kind of strategy is this?" Corvo asked aloud, unable to stop himself. The human officer turned, eyes unreadable. "Surgical disassembly. Identify the key functions of an enemy force, remove them, and leave the rest to collapse under its own weight." It sounded so simple, too simple. But as the war map updated, showing another Qadari fleet retreating in disarray, it became harder and harder to argue. Humanity wasn't overpowering the Qadari. The core of the Qadari battle doctrine was based on relentless momentum, pushing until the opponent had no time to recover. But against the humans, that tactic collapsed immediately. Every push was countered, every response anticipated. The Qadari were being dragged into a kind of warfare they weren't built for. Asymmetrical, adaptive, and terrifyingly efficient. The most disturbing part? There was no emotional charge to it. No screaming soldiers. No vengeance-fueled speeches. The human fleets moved without hatred. The officers spoke with clarity and control. They weren't here for revenge. They were here for results. "It's not war to them," Marek said slowly. "It's problem-solving." And once that realization set in, the war room shifted from disbelief to something darker, awe. Because if this was what humans could do in 5 hours, what had they been holding back? And what would happen if they ever decided to unleash their full force? "Sector Gamma has fallen," a comms officer reported, voice unsteady. "No human losses reported," another added. That line repeated so often it became almost routine. No losses, no missteps, no hesitation. It was like watching a myth unfold, except it was real, unfolding in front of their eyes, rewriting the very nature of warfare. "Where are their weaknesses?" someone finally asked. The human officer didn't answer. Instead, the display showed the human fleet adjusting again. As the Qadari shifted their remaining defenses toward what they thought was a weak point, the humans responded within seconds. Their destroyers split into micro-formations, flanking with absurd speed, cutting off escape vectors. It wasn't just tactical superiority. It was preparation taken to an obsessive level. "They don't fight like soldiers," Marek muttered. "They fight like code executing a program, one line at a time." Corvo exhaled slowly. He felt it too, that creeping sense that the war was no longer about who had more ships or bigger guns. It was about who understood the game board better. The humans didn't just understand it, they built their strategy as if they designed it. And as more Qadari positions blinked off the map, Corvo found himself asking the question that no one wanted to voice. What kind of war had humanity been preparing for all this time? Because it clearly wasn't just this one. The way they moved, the way they attacked it, was as if the Qadari were nothing more than a test run, a training scenario to be solved. They weren't just defeating an enemy, they were proving something, demonstrating what happened when a species mastered the science of war. And in that mastery, they left no room for chaos. Even when the Qadari tried to retreat, they found every escape vector cut off. When they regrouped, they were immediately flanked. When they reinforced, the supply chains were already compromised. The humans were not improvising. They were executing. "They've already anticipated the endgame," the human officer said, eyes fixed on the display. "We're just enacting it now." Corvo nodded slowly. He believed it. Every coalition fleet had spent years trying to match the Qadari's force with force. They tried brute strength, desperation, courage, and innovation. All of it had cost them dearly, but humanity had come in with none of that, only a doctrine. And in following it, they had done in 5 hours what the galaxy had failed to do in 5 years. As another Qadari command ship exploded in silence on the edge of the screen, The full weight of what was happening finally settled over Corvo's shoulders. This wasn't a battle. It was a message. And the message was terrifyingly clear. 5 hours. That was all it took. In just 5 hours since humanity officially entered the war, the unthinkable had happened. The once mighty Qadari war machine, feared across dozens of star systems, was reduced to a fractured mess. Coalition leaders who had braced for another grueling year of desperate retreats now stood frozen in their command centers, watching in awe as human forces did the impossible, not just beating the Qadari, but dismantling them, layer by layer, strategy by strategy, with chilling precision. And now, with most of the Qadari's outer defenses collapsed and their fleets scattered, all eyes turned to a single location, Qadari's Central Command. The fortress world, long believed to be untouchable, sat deep within the protective rings of layered orbital defenses, fortified stations, and minefields that had held back the coalition for years. It was the brain of the Qadari war effort, their high command, their communications hub, their symbol of control. He said so, the war was over. But that wasn't supposed to happen. Not in a single day. Not even in theory. Sir, Qadari Central is destabilizing, a comms officer announced, his voice shaking as he stared at the chaotic stream of incoming reports. Their shield arrays have failed. Human ships have breached the outer ring. Corvo leaned over the tactical display, eyes wide, trying to absorb what he was seeing. Already? He asked, almost whispering. They're launching boarding pods, the officer continued. Multiple insertions. 0 resistance reported so far. Admiral Marek shook his head in disbelief. They're going inside. That stronghold took down 6 coalition cruisers in under an hour last month. What kind of soldiers do they have that they can? They're not just soldiers, came the flat reply from the human officer standing at the back of the room. They're specialists, trained for surgical insertion and rapid command disruption. We don't fight to conquer, we fight to seize control. No one spoke. No one needed to. This wasn't a conventional victory. This was a calculated takedown. From the moment the human fleet entered the system, every move had been deliberate. They hadn't come to play the game by the old rules. They came to end it. Qadari Central Command, once believed to be a fortress beyond reach, was now under siege, not by brute force, but by intellect, coordination, and precision. The Qadari didn't know how to fight like this. Their battle doctrine had always depended on overwhelming strength and momentum. It was designed to crush, to dominate, to spread chaos. But now that same doctrine was working against them. When momentum failed, when brute strength was neutralized, the foundation crumbled. How are they managing this? One of the coalition commanders asked, his voice brittle. Training, the human officer answered again, calm and matter-of-fact. We train for multi-front engagements. Space superiority and ground operations executed in parallel. While the fleet disrupts and dismantles their outer defenses, our ground teams are already securing planetary objectives. Corvo's eyes narrowed. You trained for this level of coordination. Before the Qadari even showed up? Yes, the human replied without hesitation. Our war doctrine assumes worst-case scenarios, multi-theater conflicts, technologically superior adversaries, enemies who adapt quickly. We build our tactics around disruption, not dominance, precision, not power. There was no arrogance in his tone, just certainty, confidence grounded in years, maybe decades of relentless preparation. We thought we were fighting a war, Marek muttered, mostly to himself. But they've been running a playbook. More updates poured in. Qadari planetary defenses going dark, communication blackouts, logistics routes severed, and command relays neutralized. The entire infrastructure of the Qadari Empire was being taken apart in real time. It was surgical. It was terrifying. It was effective. The Qadari flagship is moving, the recon officer reported from the border sectors. They're attempting a tactical retreat, trying to reach a more fortified zone deeper within their territory. Marek scoffed bitterly. "Let me guess," he said, not even looking away from the screen. "The humans already anticipated this." The human officer didn't blink. "Of course. We'll allow them to fall back temporarily." Corvo looked up, visibly confused. "Allow them? You're letting them retreat?" "Yes," the human replied. "It's an old tactic. Let them reach what they believe is their final bastion. Let them feel safe. Then take even that from them." "You're toying with them," Corvo said, his voice tightening. "Not toying," the human corrected without a hint of emotion. "Ensuring the fall is complete. No room for recovery, no possibility of resurgence. This war dragged on because your forces engaged piecemeal reactive. We don't react. We eliminate variables." The room grew colder. On the map, the Qadari fleet's movements looked frantic now. Not organized repositioning, but survival instinct. They were trying to salvage what they could. But the truth was obvious: they were running. And humanity? They weren't chasing. They were herding. Reports came in of ground units already deployed across Qadari territory, striking at data centers, energy cores, and critical infrastructure. Coalition officers couldn't believe what they were hearing. "You're already running ground ops?" Corvo asked, stunned. "We barely secured orbital superiority an hour ago. Our forces trained to operate across multiple fronts simultaneously," the human replied. "Once the enemy is disoriented in space, ground units can engage key planetary targets with minimal resistance. We don't wait. We layer." The term was foreign to them. Layered warfare, a concept so refined it rendered traditional strategy obsolete. The humans weren't just fighting. They were operating a machine, every piece in perfect sync. "Planetary shields have been neutralized," came another voice. "No major resistance. Qadari forces are either surrendering or fleeing." "What kind of soldiers are these?" someone whispered. "Adaptable," the human officer replied simply. "We don't train them just to shoot. We train them to think, to analyze, to observe, adapt, and execute with minimal command input." For the first time in years, Corvo felt something more than just surprise or fear. He felt irrelevant. Like everything he'd known about military strategy was now part of an outdated manual. The humans weren't just fighting a different war, they were fighting from a different era. "What's your next move?" he asked quietly, though part of him didn't want the answer. "The flagship," the human replied. "We let it arrive at its fallback point. Then we seal the sector, blockade every exit. Once isolated, their command will be offered terms of surrender." "And if they refuse?" Marek asked, tone dark. "Then we proceed with final neutralization," the human answered. There was no anger. No anger. No emotion, just logic. "We don't fight to destroy," he added. "We fight to end conflict completely." The room fell into a heavy silence. All eyes returned to the map, where human ships had begun encircling the final Qadari stronghold. The last lights of the Empire flickered, fading one by one. And still no human losses reported. It was an ending that no one had imagined. Not with nuclear fire, not with fleets of millions, but with quiet, methodical certainty. No speeches, no mercy. Just resolution. And in that moment, as the Qadari flagship limped toward its last hope, surrounded by a fleet that had calculated its every move, Corvo finally understood the terrifying truth. Humanity had never come to fight a war. They came to finish it. It ended without fireworks, no dramatic last stand, no desperate charge into the abyss. Just a quiet message transmitted across space, short, sharp, and final. "We surrender." The words echoed through the Coalition Command Center, stripping the room of breath and sound. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It didn't feel real. After years of bloody stalemates, of systems burning, fleets shattering, and lives lost beyond count, the war was over. And it had taken less than 5 hours from the moment humanity entered the fray. General Corvo leaned forward slowly, eyes locked on the holographic feed. There it was, the bridge of the Qadari flagship, a ghost of its former glory. The once proud Qadari commander stood slumped, his uniform torn and stained with smoke, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion and rage. He stared into the feed like a cornered animal, still proud but utterly defeated. "You have only won through trickery and deception," the Qadari commander spat, voice trembling with barely contained hatred. "Not strength." The human officer standing in the coalition room didn't flinch. He stepped calmly toward the feed, his face still unreadable, his tone even. "You lost because you clung to outdated doctrines," he said simply. "Your strength relied on overwhelming force. Ours lies in adaptability, in understanding every layer of conflict." The Qadari commander said nothing. His expression shifted something between denial and reluctant recognition. "We offered peace before," the human continued. "You refused. This," he gestured toward the wreckage on the map. The sectors turned dark. The retreating enemy fleets was inevitable. The screen went black. Transmission confirmed. The Qadari had issued a full stand-down order to all remaining forces. The war was officially, irreversibly done. In the command room, there was no applause, no celebration, just silence. Because what they had witnessed wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration. Humanity hadn't just ended a war, they had redefined what war meant. Corvo finally exhaled, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like something heavier, a realization settling in his bones. The humans hadn't fought like anyone else. They hadn't fought to dominate or conquer or even defend. They had fought to end the conflict with such overwhelming certainty that its return was impossible. He turned to the human officer beside him. "How?" he asked quietly. "How did you prepare for this? For all of this?" The officer didn't hesitate. "We come from a world where conflict is part of existence," he said. "We learned long ago that survival isn't just about strength, it's about evolution, anticipation, control. Every war we've fought taught us that peace isn't granted, it's enforced." Corvo nodded slowly, absorbing the words. They weren't arrogant, they weren't boastful, just factual. To the coalition, war had always been reactive. They fought because they had to. They responded to threats. They protected borders. They made decisions based on desperation. But humanity had fought like they expected war to happen eventually, and they had built every layer of their society, military, intelligence, logistics around the idea that the first battle should be the last. "It's about finality," the human added. "About ending threats so completely that no one dares to begin again." Marek shook his head, still stunned. "But you're not occupiers. You're not taking their worlds." "No," the officer replied. "We'll stabilize them, restore infrastructure, help them rebuild under oversight, but occupation leads to resistance. We're not here to rule. We're here to make sure the Qadari or anyone like them never have the capacity to start a war again." Corvo studied him for a long time. "You've turned war into something else," he finally said. "Into strategy." The human looked over the battlefield one last time. Systems once red now glowed a cool, stable blue. Ships regrouped, no longer in combat formation, but in coordinated patterns meant for reconstruction and monitoring. "War is a tool," the human said. "Nothing more. It's not about glory, not about proving ourselves. It's a means to shape the future, to secure peace by removing instability at its root." And that's what made it terrifying. Because it worked. The coalition had poured years of lives, technology, and politics into fighting the Qadari and barely held the line. Humanity had entered, not with massive fleets or legendary weapons, but with doctrine, preparation, a cold, relentless drive to end the conflict efficiently, with minimal loss and no chance of resurgence. They've already begun stabilization protocols, the comms officer reported. Qadari planets are receiving infrastructure scans. Civilian networks are being brought back online. No military presence? Corvo asked. A few monitoring teams. Engineers, logistics coordinators. No combat troops unless required. They're not conquerors, Marek said, almost to himself. They're system architects. The term felt more accurate than anything else. The humans weren't interested in ruling. They wanted order, predictability, long-term peace through control, not fear. But it wasn't peace born from negotiation. It was peace imposed. The war had ended not with a treaty, but with a realization. The galaxy didn't need more heroes. It needed a species that treated war like math. That wasn't just unsettling, it was revolutionary. As the room emptied, as officers returned to their fleets and systems to begin the long, quiet work of peacetime recovery, Corvo remained at the center console. He watched the display update in real time. Ships moved with precision. Qadari systems blinked back online one by one, their infrastructure already being repaired. And amidst it all, not one shot was being fired anymore. The humans had no need. They'd already won. And more than that, they'd ensured that the victory would last. Corvo let out a slow breath and shook his head. So this is the future, he murmured. Behind him, the human officer stood silently, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the map. There was no pride in his stance, no self-congratulation, just quiet certainty. The war was over, but the shockwave was just beginning. Across the galaxy, from coalition outposts to once occupied worlds, the same question lingered: what now? The Qadari had fallen not gradually, not over months or even weeks, but in a few decisive, coordinated hours. It was a victory unlike any other in recorded galactic history. Yet it didn't feel like a celebration. There were no banners, no flyovers, no monuments being erected in the name of triumph. Humanity didn't linger. They didn't revel in what they'd done. They just moved forward. Fleet by fleet, their ships repositioned, not to hold territory, but to stabilize it. Data teams replaced combat units. Engineers followed strike teams. In Qadari space, lights flickered back to life. Civilian communications were restored. Power grids were rebuilt. And all of it was done with the same eerie precision as the war itself: quiet, effective, emotionless. Coalition officials scrambled to keep up. While they were still forming committees to draft post-war relief policies, the humans had already created and executed full regional recovery protocols. Entire planetary systems were scanned, assessed, and slotted into layered operational plans. It was like watching a machine clean up a mess it hadn't even made. But for all the efficiency, the galaxy was uneasy. Not because they feared another war, but because they weren't sure what peace meant anymore. General Corvo stood at the edge of a now silent command center, watching as the last of the Qadari systems turned from red to blue on the display. Systems that had once been fortresses, now repurposed hubs. Clean, controlled, functional. It felt surreal. You expected fireworks, said the human officer beside him, breaking the quiet. Corvo gave a dry chuckle. I expected anything but this. The officer nodded once, his expression as unreadable as ever. That's the point. Corvo turned to him. You planned every move, every outcome, but not for applause, not for recognition. No, the officer replied. We don't fight for that. Then what do you fight for? Corvo asked, genuinely curious now. You crushed a threat that took us years to survive. You stabilized systems before we could write the debrief reports. You ended it so quickly, so cleanly, that we don't know what to feel. So, why do it? Why go this far? The human took a long breath before answering. Because someone had to, he said. Because peace isn't born from good intentions. It's enforced through stability, through preparedness, through systems that don't allow chaos to grow in the first place. Corvo looked back at the map. You've turned war into infrastructure. We've turned it into a means, not a destination. It was hard to argue. In the weeks that followed, coalition forces returned to their home sectors. There was no more need for mass deployments. The Qadari were disarmed, disbanded, and monitored not with cruelty, but with exacting consistency. No revenge, no punishment campaigns, just structure, controlled reintegration into the galactic community, supervised by human administrative liaisons, AI logistical networks, and remote advisors. Not conquerors, custodians. The Coalition's Military Council released a formal statement lauding humanity's role in the swift resolution of hostilities. But behind closed doors, discussions turned philosophical and at times fearful. What had they just witnessed? What kind of civilization trains for total war in peacetime? Not for conquest, but to end wars that haven't even started. And if that's what humanity could do with a fraction of their force, what else were they capable of? In public, they were hailed as heroes. Privately, they were watched with caution. But the humans didn't posture. They didn't issue ultimatums. They didn't rewrite laws or demand control. They simply rebuilt what was broken, ensured no one could break it again, and then returned home. Corvo was one of the few who got to see it up close from the start to the end. And long after the final fleet left, long after the screens dimmed and the war rooms were empty, he found himself staring at old records, wondering what the real lesson was. It wasn't about firepower. It wasn't even about strategy. It was about mindset. The humans had approached the war like a surgeon approaches a dying patient methodically, emotionally detached and with a singular purpose: to remove the infection, preserve what was still living, and ensure it never returned. And in doing so, they had revealed a truth no one wanted to confront. Victory doesn't belong to the strongest. It belongs to the most prepared. It was a lesson the galaxy wouldn't forget. The real-world connection, a lesson in preparedness and responsibility. As Corvo's story faded into the pages of history, its message echoed far beyond the fictional battlefield. Because behind the starships, the alien alliances, and the sci-fi grandeur, there was a human truth embedded in the heart of the narrative. The future doesn't belong to those who react. It belongs to those who prepare. In our world, conflict may not come in the form of interstellar wars, but we still face challenges just as complex. Pandemics, climate change, misinformation, political instability, economic collapse, and like the Coalition, we often respond too late, react instead of prepare, hope instead of plan. The story of humanity's calculated victory reminds us that hope is not a strategy, that peace is not the default. It's a product of vigilance, coordination, and hard choices made before the crisis hits. The nations, organizations, and individuals who take that lesson seriously, who plan for what others ignore, will be the ones who shape the outcome. But there's a deeper layer too. Humanity in the story didn't fight for revenge. They didn't seek glory. They didn't conquer. They intervened to stop the bleeding, to close the wounds so completely that reopening it would be unthinkable. In that, they represent a model of responsible power, the kind that doesn't boast, but acts when it must, and only as far as it needs to. That's the other lesson. Power is not just the ability to win. It's the wisdom to stop once the goal is achieved. In the end, we're all part of a complex system, local, national, global. Whether we're leaders or workers, dreamers or doers, the question remains: Will we be caught off guard by the storms to come, or will we prepare now to ensure peace lasts longer than the conflict ever could? Just like in the story, peace is not the absence of war. It is the presence of design. And the future, our real future, will be written by those who understand that.